This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. We have a merchandise store on TeePublic. You can get all of your Graceful Atheist and Secular Grace themed items there. The link will be in the show notes. If you're in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, the dark night of the soul, you do not have to do it alone. Join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, and become a part of the community. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. Arlene interviews this week's guest, Sara. Sara grew up in Canada in a Mennonite community that also had a lot of evangelical influence. Her and her husband were both deeply committed Christians. Her husband deconstructed and deconverted first, and Sara began to deconstruct her faith. Sara is still a spiritual person and does not care for labels, but what she is describing is a Christian or a spiritual humanism. Here is Arlene interviewing Sara.
Sara, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You and I have chatted. We're both in the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group. You are the lovely spouse of one of our former guests. And yay, I'm just excited I get to talk to you.
I'll take it.
Yay. Okay. So we usually just start. Tell us about the religious environment that you grew up in.
Sure. So I grew up in small town Manitoba, Canada, and that is a cold place, but it was full of warm-hearted people for me growing up evangelical Mennonite Christian. So I'm not sure who's all familiar with Mennonite people out there, but a lot of people in the States could think of Amish people for a first comparison. We still have people groups in that tradition up here with the bonnet and the old-fashioned dress, the modest dress, but mostly progressive communities. So modern communities full of evangelical-based Mennonite Christians. So that's how I grew up, was just being ushered into the faith. So I've learned the term cradle Christian, and that definitely applies to me. So I remember being told that I said the sinner's prayer around age 4. So, in smack in the age of innocence, just reciting to my parents at bedtime the sinner's prayer, and thus becoming a Christian. And my parents described to me our faith, our family history, as culturally we came from Mennonites, but our faith was more progressive. So we did attend a non-denominational church in our community, which of course was full of evangelicals. So non-denomination or not, that's what I grew up in, and really embraced wholeheartedly the faith. And so for me, that looked like, let's see if I can age myself and give you guys a date reference. In the 90s, growing up as a teenager, a little bit of purity culture, a lot of the youth rallies, evangelical mainstream musicians and concerts, and a lot of the culture that I was involved in was all Christian. So from morning to sundown was Christian media and Christian teaching. I did not go to Christian school. We had public school, but really was not exposed to other ways of life or other faiths or other cultures. Really just, what's the word? One tone, just a uniform tone in our small town, at least. And I guess you could say I wasn't popular growing up, but I was good. And in the Christian circles, that made one feel pretty secure. And the affirmation of elders and peers was something that I enjoyed and sought and was rewarded with because of being good. And um, I I was really good at being a Christian and enjoyed it. And um, I would say I was lucky that we did grow up, I would say, more progressive. And the purity culture stuff that did come around indoctrinated a lot of the younger teenagers, younger than me at the time. And I didn't get hit with too much of that guilt messaging. But as I grew up into young adulthood, I took the opportunity, of course, to take the next step from being a good Christian in my small town to being a good Christian in a small college, a small Christian college. So our community has a Christian college about 7 minutes away from the town. And so that was my big leap forward out of high school into the big wide, wide world, 7 minutes down the gravel road away from my house where I grew up my whole youth. And at this school, I would say I did receive, again, a more progressive Christian evangelical education. So in that way, continued to avoid some of the more, the pitfalls, some of the more abusive messaging. I would say that the messaging I received was stay on the straight and narrow and listen to your elders. And really the messaging other than that was you know, that women were submissive to men, but that was never really something that was something that I struggled with. And it was never rammed down our throats, maybe because nobody questioned it. So regardless of why the messaging didn't seem that traumatic for me, it did enable me to keep mostly an open mindset, I guess. So it was at this Christian college that I would say I continue to learn a more open minded and open hearted way of being a person of faith. I did go on to take a marketing degree somewhere else and return to work at this college. And the marketing challenge that I was presented with when I worked there was very interesting to me because the school was transitioning from I'm not sure what they would have been called beforehand, but they were embracing what was called a liberal arts education. And so the liberal arts in our area of Canada, all people heard was the word liberal. And they thought this college was off the rails, and that was it. However, how I understood it then and how I understand it now is liberal arts is just a wide range of studies. It's a broad spectrum education, and that's what they were seeking to provide. So I would contrast that with other colleges where the religious messaging is heavy-handed and inescapable. And as much as this college wasn't perfect, they did present, as far as I understood it, a more open way of being. So as I transitioned from attending the college to, ending up working there, I met my husband there, and he was, you guessed it, a very good Christian. at the time. We were well matched, both of us wanting to be not just good Christians, but leaders in our community. So leading as someone who worked at the college was what I was fully embracing. And my husband eventually ended up working in ministry. We were volunteering at our church multiple times per week. He was volunteering and working full time with youth. And that was always interesting to me as well, as he was full time employed in ministry. And I was expected to come and help. And this was a fully unpaid understanding, was that I would be there to support and help, but also lead and teach teenage girls and be a mentor to them. And I didn't question it. I enjoyed it. I felt that there was room for me as a strong, outspoken woman to have leadership skills. It wasn't until later that I would realize that in all of that, the ability to fully use my voice, my intellect, was still completely under the leadership of others, especially under the leadership of men. So from there, we had started a family. We had a young family, and I would say a catalyst to our growth, my husband and I, would be when we did start a family. One of the things about having children, having a baby, what is the expression? Having your heart on the outside, walking around in the world, having your heart outside of you, walking around in the world. We both experienced that intense vulnerability that comes with realizing we're not in control. We pray to and believe in and trust in this big, omnipotent God, and yet there's suffering in the world, and there are things that can happen to your loved ones. So the problem of pain, the problem of suffering, the fear of not being in control, and wondering why there's a God that would allow suffering. We did have a few intense health scares with our first child, so that really prompted in both of us this question of, what kind of God is this that we believe in? We started to question a little deeper. Hey, what's up with that? The questioning, I would say, led to my husband deconverting first.
Mm-hmm.
So the deconversion of one spouse when the other isn't ready or hasn't made the same types of growth or the same direction of growth, that's something that we confronted early on. I would say my husband found it difficult to tell me what he was going through for fear of what I would say, and just not necessarily fear, but the intense, honest discomfort that comes with realizing your spouse and you are different and growing differently. And my husband at the time was studying Christian psychology and pursuing his master's in Christian counseling. A lot of the benefit of being a spouse of a student is that you learn a little bit alongside with them, definitely not to the same extent that he was learning, receiving the training directly, but watching and watching the books that he'd bring home and hearing him talk about what he was learning did benefit me as well. And I knew he was questioning, and I did question a lot of the things I was told from the Bible as well. One of the areas that we immediately agreed on was the area of the Bible as a book, a literature book,
Mm-hmm.
and for context, how it was put together and who wrote it and when and why, and learning about the different types of literature contained within this book, being open to the Bible as myth, being open to portions of the Bible as poetry and art. We eventually realized that the Bible being the be all and end all, it, it it didn't strike us the same way as it used to. Using the Bible as a rule book, using the Bible as law, more than just as a place to find messaging about values, just using it as the foundation for everything, for all sources of thought, was not something that we could both condone. I would say I was very at peace with that. As you can probably tell, living in the headspace and questioning and learning and embracing my intellect is not something that I would say that I naturally gravitate toward. That's not me. I was always the one who would say I have the gift of faith. I don't question. I just believe. I just know. And even as we were growing and changing, it didn't seem very unrestful to me because we were still good Christians. We were still going to church. We were still leading in the community. And we also experienced some freedom in what my husband was doing in his ministry, where we were learning about evangelicalism as relational instead of we called it relational instead of vacuum cleaner salesman evangelicalism. So instead of saying, up front, hey, we're here, we're a Christian, you should be too. Why aren't you one? Here's how you can be one. Why aren't you one yet? Very heavy-handed salesmanship. We embraced relationship first. I would describe this as an immature way of knowing that love is more important than law. And we wouldn't have had the words for it then, but we were thankfully supported to continue to do ministry without being heavy-handed or I would use the word abusive now. We were able to be loving in as much as providing religious propaganda in central, rural, small town Manitoba can be loving. So I would say I knew my husband had become atheist before he did. I remember that conversation on our house. On our couch. We're both night owls. We were staying up way too late, having one of our discussions like we do. And maybe I wasn't being the most loving at the time. But I remember telling him, after he'd told me for a few years he was agnostic Christian, which then I had to look that up and make sure that I knew what that meant. And at the time I could say, okay, yeah, I understand agnosticism and being able to say that I hold a view of God or what is out there, and I don't know for sure. And there are more learned and technical definitions than that. But the way I understood it very simply was, this is what I think I believe, but I may be wrong, and I hold that opinion loosely. So for him to tell me for years he was agnostic Christian, I was fine with. And I looked at him one night and I said, you're not agnostic Christian. You're agnostic atheist. And that term, that's a laden term. So, for anyone, and I think I know your audience pretty well. There's probably a lot of people out there who, for a long time, that term atheist was so laden with guilt and fear and condemnation. And it was probably the worst thing that could happen to someone was, oh, they've turned into an atheist. Um, and so for me at the time, even though our growth as people, our development as people was heading in that direction, it definitely scared me. And I think more so than the label was just the implication for our partnership and the questions that that would raise. How would we raise our kids? How would we celebrate the holidays? The really practical ins and outs of having a partnership between two people where their faiths are so different. And for the next year or two after that, I would say my growth continued. But I wouldn't say necessarily the same direction. And now this is probably where it might get interesting. Because as much as I could look at what I believed and see that the term agnostic fit with me as well, agnostic Christian, I couldn't quite embrace the term atheist. And so that's kind of where we parked for a long time. As we both continued to grow, my husband getting more and more comfortable with the term agnostic atheist, eventually found his way to a community who Humanist Canada, the community of Humanist Canada, and so for him to announce to me that he had become a humanist, that was the next step in his growth, and I still felt a little left behind. I still felt a little bit like that wasn't the right direction for me. I did look into humanism for a while and tried on the label of Christian humanist. And I wrote a few essays developing the idea and making a case for Christian humanism, which I believe there is a case for that type of belief. But along the way, of my studying on my own, not professionally, just casually, I'm pursuing my own topics and books that kind of served me on my growth path. I realized that I didn't like any of this anymore, any of these labels. I didn't like the Christian label. I didn't fit the atheist label. I didn't fit the humanist label. I didn't fit the deist label, theist label. I every label that someone suggested to me or put on me, there was always something that didn't quite fit about it. Portions of it would fit and others wouldn't. And I struggled with feeling about, where did that leave me? What type of community did that leave me with? And then COVID hit.
And then COVID.
And
Oh my
then
goodness.
COVID. I feel like that's every single story these days, or every single interview. There's the point in their history, and then COVID. So the loss of community was happening for me before COVID. And the first year of COVID in our small town cemented my husband and I, our shared need to be out, to be out of the church. There was not really a path forward for us that continued to see us in the church. I was working in communications at the time. I was actually a small town journalist. Small town journalism at the beginning of COVID, when all of our governments were doing what they were doing and doing what they could, what they thought they needed to do during the beginning of COVID. And I was also on the communications team for our church, and realized that I needed distance from the church. And COVID eventually became a gift. The quarantining, the bubbling, the distance from the community became a space to breathe. And I know it's cliche, but there's people who would say, there's more people now that would say they're not a Christian. They're still a Jesus follower. And that's where I saw myself, Jesus
Mm-hmm.
follower, for a while. And eventually, I wouldn't say that that part has necessarily um, fallen off, but I started to find other ways of finding information, finding community, and finding teaching outside of Christianity, outside of the Christology that I'd grown up with, that just made sense. And once you find things that just make sense, you can't go back. What I deconstructed from is easier to define. Evangelical Christianity is what I deconstructed from. And I would definitely say deconverted from. And we haven't found our way back to a church. There's no plans in the future to return to a church. That's not a healthy environment for us. It's not where we find that there's life-giving activity for us. And what I've reconstructed to is harder to define. So I think I'll leave it there as far as giving you a history of where I've come from and where I'm at.
So I have a few questions.
Yes.
You said there were other ways that you found. I'm not sure the words that you used, but like other ways of thinking about things that you found. What do you have any examples of some of the no longer Christian things that you were finding that were helpful to you?
Yes, there were some big ones that ended up being my non-negotiables. One of the first ones that I had to turn away from was the term would be complementarianism, the idea that the genders, the idea, first of all, that there's two genders and that one is subordinate to the other. That became a no-fly zone for me, a no-go zone. It just did not add up. And the way I rebuilt from that was finding, first of all, a healthy dose of feminist theology.
Nice.
Once I immersed myself in feminist theology and knew that it wasn't wrong, it was biblically supported, and more than that, it was holistically healthy for women to be seen as equals and operate in the world as equals. I could not subscribe to a church or faith tradition that views women as less than men. So I've constructed the author that helped me the most, I would say, would be Rosemary Radford Ruther, and she's an ecumenical Episcopalian Catholic. What other labels can we give to her? Eco theologian, feminist theologian. And she passed away just a few years ago after a lengthy career in writing and pursuing theology and teaching. And of course, I can't remember the Catholic school she was at. Come on, brain. But her writing, very technically heavy, theologically textbooky, it gripped me and provided for me something to set my back against, so that I didn't need to just say, I don't think that it's
Mm-hmm.
correct that women are subordinate to men. Now I have some theology that made sense to me. Now that I've come to where I am, I wish I could say I've picked up a lot more non-religious feminism. There's no authors for me to name drop there, and that's on my list of things to continue pursuing. The idea of hell,
Okay.
that was so the idea of hell as an eternal place of torment became something I could no longer believe in. And turning toward more progressive ideas of universalism became a way for me to stay as a Christian. And as I continue to grow, the idea that everyone is loved, it's an idea that transcends religion. It transcends Christianity. And the universalist theology made sense to me, but just a mindset of love and acceptance. You don't need a textbook to flesh that idea out.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that we're all connected and all okay and loved, that was something that kept me growing. And interestingly enough, I would say the idea of time. And now is where, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth over this issue, but I started to find issues representative in science. Physics, the study of matter and energy, became extremely fascinating to me. And realizing that a spiritual being attached to a concept of time that we as humans could possibly begin to understand, it became evident to me that in my tradition of Christian evangelicalism, the concept of linear time had to be upheld in order for the concept of morality and goodness and final judgment to make those concepts possible. You had to hold up this linear version of time. And I didn't like that. It didn't sit well with me.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that makes sense. There has to be an end and then a hell and then like a, yeah, wow.
Yeah. So to realize that our universe is growing and expanding, and that the Christian God doesn't fit with science, that became something that I needed to dig into. My husband, being the more intellectual one, challenged me in that regard a lot. And it became kind of fun because we would often read articles or read books. He'd read the whole thing. I would just read portions. But Who did we enjoy? Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse
Yeah.
Tyson. Um, there's more. I'm trying to remember who else we've read, and I'm not so good with names all the time. Anyway, the game that we would play between the two of us was that he would read an article based on physics and say, "See, there's no God." And
Mm-hmm.
I would read the same article and I would say, "See, God is so much bigger than how we understood."
That's amazing. I love that y'all could have that conversation, and it's fascinating to watch two people read the same thing. And yeah, the interpretation, the takeaway, the inferences are different. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you say earlier, you said like we're all okay and we're loved. I don't even know how to ask this question. Like, is it a by whom, or is it just like an inherent worthiness, or is there a God, little g, quotation marks,
Hmm.
or is it still like up in the air because you don't have to have answers and all that good stuff?
For me, it's still up in the air. I like, for someone who I would describe myself, and others, of course, would agree with me and call me an all or nothing person. For someone who's an all or nothing person, faith for me has not become an all or nothing zone.
Huh.
And I guess what I'm trying to say is I still use the term God, but what I'm talking about, what I believe in, is not what Christians, the way I understand them, I would say 99.99% of the Christians I grew up with, they would not understand if I just use the word God. Rosemary Radford rather suggests, for the sake of egalitarianism, of course, she suggests using, on paper anyway, it doesn't translate very well to spoken word, but she recommends using the term God slash des. So capital God slash DESS, to represent both genders of God.
Well, that's okay. Goddess. Okay, I see it. God and
Mm-hmm.
goddess.
Yeah. I enjoy that, but also I don't view God as both male and female. And I don't view God as, oh, God is genderless. That is
Mm-hmm.
another way of looking at God. That doesn't resonate with me. I finally landed on God being gender full. So as
Hmm.
the spectrum of gender becomes something that science and Western society, as we understand it, begins to wrap their heads around, realizing that if one believes in God, I believe God is gender full. And I started creating a document for myself as a writer, as a researcher. I've started creating a document for myself to collect names for God. I'm not happy with any of them. and there are some that I like more than others. So when you dig into the different traditions surrounding God, capital God is what Christians are comfortable with. Jewish tradition not writing the name of God and seeing the name of God as being holy and not even capturable in a written form. That intrigues me. Terms like the great mystery, the divine, the source of all being, the ground of all being, the most ancient parents. Um, there's some poetical language and some scientific language for God that really resonates with me. And I think that's indicative of, again, not needing to be fully in
Mm-hmm.
or fully out. So the way I see God is that source of love, that connection, the embodiment, the whole way of approaching and enacting and being part of love. To me, that's God.
Oh, I have a hard time separating the word God from, the stuff that I was taught. I have enjoyed or liked, let's see, when I was on my way out and didn't know I was on my way out, but I was just reading different books. I was reading Anne Lamott's work, like her more explicitly Christian stuff. And she always talked about God and called her and she. And that was fun for me, that just little experience of the feminine pronouns for what I had always thought of as masculine God. And again, I didn't know I was on my way out, but that was a nice little change. Eventually it shifted and I liked the idea of goddesses until I read about a bunch of the goddesses and I like, they're all heifers. I don't like any of them. Like, they're all just terrible. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I don't believe in gods and goddesses and things like that. And at the same time, I like the idea of just some kind of, whatever the reason is, that love seems to be so important for humans, for primates, for animals to exist well, for our species to keep going. Like, that, it does us well when we cooperate and are kind and loving and all these kinds of things. So I love that. I'm like, I'm here for that. I'm here for that. So you and the hubs, he's his atheist self, and you are your unlabeled, wonderful self. How are the conversations these days? Do you guys just let one another do whatever works for you? Is there any conflict? How did you decide about raising kids and holidays and all those things you mentioned earlier? Would you guys or how'd y'all figure that out? Or are you still figuring it out?
Yeah, we're still figuring it out. There's no right or wrong way
Mm-hmm.
to do this. So we do feel a lot of freedom in that regard. And a lot of our conflict has dissipated. I think the confusion or fear about what each other believes or why or how it's going to impact us, a lot of that has just dissipated with time. When you're in it, it's scary, and when you've been in it a long time, it's not as scary anymore. um, and we for how strong-willed both of us are, we did find a way to let each other be ourselves and let
Mm-hmm.
each other grow how we would grow. And for me, that ended up looking like, after experiencing the loss of community, I didn't want to stop growing. I didn't want to stop trying to find people who were like minded. One of the authors that I had picked up earlier in my deconstruction was Kathleen Norris. And for someone coming out of an evangelical tradition, just to be exposed to a writer, for me, who represented feminism and an open-minded, open-hearted way of being, but someone who had been an atheist and came back into the church, and why, was very interesting to me. How she seemed to retain an intellectual integrity and open her heart up to what ways she could grow as a human. And so her book, um, The Cloister Walk, was one of the first ones that I read. And in her frustration with the church community that she was just kind of finding her way back into, those were the same frustrations that I had found were leading me out of the church. And I thought both trajectories were a-okay. And that felt good. That amount of acceptance felt good. Frustration vocalized healthily can lead to making healthy steps and choices away from abusive situations, away from dogmatic theology, away from confinement, into more open-minded ways of experiencing the world. And from there, she helped introduce me to the Benedictine way of living, which to me was a delightful way of incorporating spirituality without the heavy-handedness of what I'd experienced in evangelicalism, which is so funny because you think about monks living in community with rigid rules and expectations,
Mm-hmm.
and how could that be a place of more freedom than the modern church? And without judgment, I just say that that's a mirror for the Western church to be looking at themselves through. That's for sure. When a life of aestheticism becomes the way of freedom, um, it just ended up fascinating me. What I ended up doing to continue to pursue studies and growth while my husband was finishing not a counseling master's in counseling in a Christian school. He was finishing a master's of science in a secular university. While he was finishing that, I ended up looking into taking courses and studies in what I would eventually know as spiritual direction. So through the Benedictine community close to where I live, they offered a 2-year certificate in spiritual direction. But what interested me most, what fascinated me about what they offered, was the open-handed way of offering what they knew, with a take it or leave it, gentle kind of way of offering spiritual study. So the program ended up being something that I couldn't take until COVID hit, and it could be fully operational online,
Oh,
and
yeah.
suddenly became something that fit into our lifestyle and what I was able to make work with my schedule. And the program itself being open to anyone from any faith, from
That's
any spiritual
powerful.
tradition, became something that was very important to me. So I didn't want more Christian education. I wanted spiritual education. I wanted to know, if I'm not a Christian, what else is there? What can I still be? And for me, that program really helped to answer a lot of those questions. But more importantly, it showed me which questions served me and which questions didn't. Um, Questions that resulted in closed thinking or closed loop answers. Let's just say the Benedictines are not great at those questions. They're good at the kind of questions that leave you asking more questions. And to
That's good.
me, yeah,
Yeah.
to me, that represented the freedom to arrive where you're going to arrive
Mm-hmm.
in your spiritual journey, whether that is to remain a Christian or not, whether that's to be a humanist or not, or an atheist, as long as the way of being in the world is loving and open, that seemed to be okay. and I liked that.
Yeah, like love and kindness and the things that are mostly universal. I don't know if they are fully universal, but that most societies see as very important and very necessary, yeah, again, for us to thrive. They're not inherently Christian. They're not owned by Christianity. Like, and even within Christianity, there's so many different versions of it. We're exposed to this one very evangelical white, I'll say North American, you and I, different countries, North American version of Christianity, Western, I guess. And like you were talking about the Benedictines, and then there's Orthodox churches, and I mean, just Christianity looks very different in different places, and spirituality looks different. And I love that you've been able to figure out like what feels best and is right for you, and knowing that we have that kind of freedom when you leave the more constricting, what's the word? High something religions, high demand religions.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything I should have asked? We have a few more minutes. Is there anything I should have asked but didn't that you want to talk about?
I'm just trying to think if there's any more pieces of the puzzle that would lend any clarity. If I would just name another author that helped me on my journey, anyone looking for further reading, if any of your listeners are still deconstructing, still in the process of deconverting, because as I mentioned, I'm not a black and white thinker anymore. It's not a switch that gets flipped. I'm a Christian and then flip the switch. Now I'm not. The spectrum of faith is wide, and Thomas Keating helped me on my way as far as presenting an open minded theology that insisted that science be involved and included and important in a holistic way of being, in a way of being a spiritual human. There's no conflict with looking at the way the world is made and coming up with new ways to think about it and new language to talk about it. Thomas Merton, another Thomas, from Thomas Merton's righteous anger in the 60s, and his writing, and just one of his final lectures, admonishing people, encouraging people, exhorting people to be open to language, to learning about, why do we say the things that we do about God, and why is it written that way, and where did that come from? And hey, doesn't this tradition in Christian meditation mirror that in Eastern religions? And from there, I tucked myself into some Buddhist studies for a while, and from realizing the practices of Buddhism, the commitment to lessening the suffering of others, and how that's not in conflict with Christianity, with how I want to live, and realizing that truth is truth.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a loaded word these days. Everyone claiming to have the capital R, real, capital T, truth, and realizing that even though it's subjective, you'll know it, and you'll know with whom you share your definition of God. You'll know with whom you share your definition of love. You'll know with whom you share your definition of truth. If you hold that openly. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yes, that's a lovely place to end. Sarah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I would ask for recommendations, but girl, you name dropped so many fantastic authors and books that people can find who are still Christians, like Thomas Merton and Kathleen Norris, Richard Rohr. I would put him in there.
Richard Rohr's in there. Anyone with a psychotherapy bent or psychology bent, Carl Jung, Jungian psychology has been really formative for me as well. And yeah, just realizing that there's a whole host of authors, there's a whole host of ways of being in the world that aren't Christian, as in it. Being pegged, being in the box, and it's okay. And it's scary at first, but once you're out there, it's wide open and wonderful.
How can people find you online? If you're doing spiritual direction, is there a way people can find you online?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do spiritual direction. I also just write my own reflections on life and the world and deconstruction. So I have a website called The Prairie Thistle. Two words that are really hard to spell, and I don't know why I picked them, but just spell check and you'll find it. www.prairiethistle.ca because I'm in Canada. So yeah.
Okay, well we'll put all the links in the show notes so people can find you. And thank you again for being on the podcast, Sarah. This was lovely.
Thank you, Arlene.
My final thoughts on the episode. So when I've already talked to someone and gotten to know them, I get really excited when I get to speak with them on the podcast because I just know they're lovely and wonderful and I get excited. And Sara was no exception. It was such a great conversation. She's so kind and gentle spoken, and I could listen to her forever. Girl, you need to narrate some books. There you go. That's your future job. My final thoughts on the episode. There are so many, I don't know to call them universal truths, because I'm sure there are places where things are not absolutely true, but like it seems for humans to survive as a species and for us to survive interspecially with other animals and plants, fungi, the whole earth, like love, kindness, cooperation, empathy, like there's so many things that seem to be integral for us no matter where we live. Like Christianity does not have a hold on humility, kindness, gentleness, whatever the fruit of the Spirit, whatever they were. These are just good things to have. And she kept using the word openness, like if we can be open to things. And I can't cite the science, but I've heard on plenty of podcasts, 10% Happier podcast talks about it a lot. And I don't know where else, but when we stay open to things and we're not judgmental about things and we're not closed to whether or not we could be wrong, it's just good for us. Our mental health is better. Our nervous system is less activated when we stay open to things, when we are willing to be wrong, when we're willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, when we're willing to hear new information and not be closed off to it. Like it's just good for us. And so staying open, being loving, not at the expense of our boundaries and our own personal well-being, but loving others, because Christianity will teach you to love others and it'll just burn you out. And that's not good. Last thing, she also talked about having children and the problem of pain and suffering. Like when they had children, she and her husband realized, like, she didn't say this explicitly, but I've heard it from a few different places. And this was true when my husband deconverted. It's like, we should not feel like we are better parents to our children because we treat them better than God treats his kids. That doesn't seem like we should be more moral, more ethical, more kind and loving than God is. And yeah, there's so much suffering in the world. Trying to square up the God we're taught is in the Bible with what we actually see in the world and what we actually see in the Bible. That takes a lot of gymnastics, a lot of mental gymnastics. And it's just not worth it. It's not worth it at all. Sara, thank you again for being on the podcast. It was wonderful, and I really enjoyed it.
The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is humanism. This podcast has, from day one, been about humanism. And what that means to me is caring for people. I believe in people. With hindsight, I recognize that I had been a religious humanist, and after deconversion, it was a natural move to being a secular humanist. But really, my core values of caring for people did not change. Maybe my reasons did, but it did not change. I legitimately do not care if people are spiritual but not religious, or Christian, or Muslim, or Jewish, if they care about people. If they recognize that relationships with other human beings is the most important thing in the universe. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast.